Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's ITA Clean Sport Education webinar, Beyond Performance, Building Resilience and Identity for Clean Sport. I am Nikki Hamblin, a member of the education team at the ITA. Before we start, just a few housekeeping points. This session will be delivered in English with simultaneous interpretation available in Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish. Please note, this session is also being recorded for those who can't join us live today. You also have the option to use automated translated captions. You can select your preferred language in the Zoom menu. And please note that these captions are a translation of the original English voice, and in the event of any discrepancies, the meaning and spirit of the English version will prevail. So, this month's topic is Beyond Performance, Building Resilience and Identity for Clean Sport. This session is about something that sits at the heart of both sporting success and well-being. How you as athletes can build resilience, develop a healthy sense of identity, and strengthen your commitment to clean sport. When people think about doping, they often imagine it as the result of a single choice or a moment of poor judgment. But the reality is often much more complex. Research shows that doping is influenced by a range of interacting factors. Things like pressure to perform, fear of failure, injury, stress, the environment around the athlete, and the support systems that they have in place. That's why preventing doping isn't only about knowing the rules, it's also about athletes developing the strengths, resources, and support networks that make it easier for them to make healthy and ethical decisions. And this is even during challenging moments. Today, we're going to focus on those strengths, often referred to as protective factors. One protective factor is identity. Specifically, having a sense of who you are beyond your sporting results. For many athletes, sport plays a huge role in life. It can shape how you spend your time, who you spend it with, and how you see yourself. And that's completely understandable. Pursuing excellence requires dedication, commitment, and focus. But challenges are somewhat inevitable. For example, there might be injuries, setbacks, deselection, or periods of poor performance. During these moments, an athlete whose entire identity is tied to performance can find themselves particularly vulnerable. When success and self-worth become closely connected, pressure can feel overwhelming. By contrast, an athlete who recognizes that they are more than their performance, who has interests, values, relationships, and goals beyond sport, often have a stronger foundation to draw upon when challenges arise. Importantly, having a broader identity doesn't reduce ambition. It can enhance resilience, perspective, and well-being. And this matters for clean sport because athletes with a strong sense of self and confidence that extends beyond performance outcomes are often better equipped to navigate pressure and stay aligned with their values. So our goal is not simply to talk about avoiding doping, but to share expertise and experience on conditions that can help success be achieved in the right way. We are incredibly fortunate today to be joined by someone who brings both professional expertise and lived experience to this topic. Dr. Lenny Waite is a licensed psychologist, a certified mental performance consultant, and an Olympian. Having competed at the highest level herself, she understands the realities of elite sport, the pressures athletes face, and the challenges that come with balancing performance and well-being. Alongside that experience, her work in psychology gives her a unique insight into resilience, identity development, and human performance. And with that, it is my absolute pleasure to hand the floor over to Dr. Lenny Waite.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Nikki. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody on this webinar. I've been watching the comments roll in of where people are from, and it's so great to have people from all corners of the world. I'm really excited to talk about building resilience and identity for clean sport this morning. And before we do that, I'm going to add on just a little bit more about my background, some of my personal journey in sport, and what I do today. So I'm currently based in Houston, Texas. I saw there was another person in Texas on this webinar. I'm the Chief Science Officer at Height EQ, which is a technology platform that is invested in getting mental performance skills into the hands of athletes at scale. So youth athletes, college age athletes, and professional athletes. My PhD was in industrial organizational psychology. Again, I'm a licensed psychologist and a certified mental performance consultant. I work across all sports, a range of athletes. If it's a sport, I've probably helped an athlete in that sport across my decade of helping athletes after competing in the Olympics in the 3,000 meter steeplechase. Um, Slide, please. Um, you can see from this image, I was an athlete. I competed in the steeplechase in 2016. But prior to that, I was a soccer player. I grew up internationally, so was born in Scotland to British parents, lived in Switzerland, Singapore, Austin, London growing up. So got to experience sport in all corners of the world. I grew up doing every single sport possible. And my identity as a person is still deeply tied to sport. And I've worked really proactively to continue to build an identity outside of sport in my friendships, my relationships, my role as a mother, my role as an educator, in order to help me be able to give the most in my sport by having an avenue outside of sports that I can pull energy from. My journey in sport was maybe a little bit non-traditional. I actually went to university at Rice University in Houston, Texas, as a soccer athlete. So the picture on this slide is of me playing soccer at college in the U.S. I was recruited off of that soccer field to run track and field. So if we have people who and you probably run as a part of your sport, very challenging sport, can feel lonely, very physically challenging. It took a lot for me to wrap my head around the mentality of being a great distance runner. But I was fortunate enough to come across a coach who really empowered me to build the mental skills, the self-belief, and the aspects around sport that actually allowed me to love the sport and fear less of the pressure of competing and racing. And that is a big part of what has inspired me to continue to run today and also to continue to work in the world of sports psychology and mental performance. Slide, please. So what is sports psychology? Oftentimes when I introduce my role, I like to ask people a few questions. So you can answer in your head, you can put the answer in the chat if you want to, just to elevate the importance of the mental side of sport. Have any of you ever performed better in training versus competition? For example, maybe you've done great things in practice or you're training on your training grounds. You feel like you're really ready to compete, and then you go into that competition, and what you've done in that training grounds doesn't transfer to that competition venue. I want you to think about that just briefly. Yes. Have you ever felt overly nervous or anxious before a big competition to the point that it's hurt your performance? We often talk about that zone of optimal performance where your nerves are at that right level to really make you compete well. But the reality is, a lot of people go beyond that, and those nerves can actually hurt their performance. And then lastly, have you ever had a game plan in mind or a way to approach competition that you feel like you've committed to prior to entering that competitive arena? But when it came time to execute, you really couldn't. You just found yourself falling into bad habits or not being able to actually execute the plan that you wanted to. Slide, please. So when I ask those three questions, it really highlights the fact that there's a lot of mental aspect that goes into sports. So typically when people feel overly nervous or they feel like they didn't train as well, and they didn't compete as well in competition, they oftentimes go back to their sporting arena and put in more physical effort. They try harder. They add an extra strength and conditioning session. They maybe add more physical training. But the thing with those three questions around nerves or translating performance from training to competition or actually being able to execute your game plan when the pressure is on, that has to do with what's going on between your ears. So, what are you thinking about? How are you approaching that competition? What are you saying to yourself in the build up to that competition? It's not actually the more physical training. So maybe people have heard the phrase that sport is 95% mental. And I love that phrase. And being a sports psychologist, I really do believe in the mentality of the sport. But I guarantee from the sports that I saw listed here, I don't think I could just think about boxing and become a great boxer or dream about skating and become a great skater. There is a lot of physical training that goes into every sport. However, at the highest level, it is the mentality of that athlete that distinguishes them or allows them to reach that top level of performance. So whenever you look at a starting line or at a competition, all of those athletes have done an incredible amount of physical work to get there. But whoever has the mentality on the day, who can control their nerves, who can translate their performance from the training ground to the competition ground, and who can execute on their game plan, that is the athlete that is most likely to have success on the day. And that is the mental side of sport. Slide, please. Now, the great thing about sports is how they're invigorating and they're fun to watch and people love them. I think one thing that is so great about working in sports is you go to all corners of the world and everybody speaks a common sport language. However, within the world of sports, there are a lot of unique stressors that people in other jobs don't experience. So you can see in this picture of this 100-meter final, the margins at the top are very, very small. You can line up to compete, you can be in a match against somebody, and your physical performance is very similar. What it takes to win on the day is sometimes a little bit of luck, hopefully a little bit of more preparation, but it's extremely competitive to compete at the top. Outcomes are also constantly emphasized. So sports are very tied to metrics. We're looking at times, place, data. And with the revolution around sports technology, we have more data tied to every single training session, our sleep, what we're eating, how we're training, how we're competing. And all of those metrics just create more focus on the outcome, which ultimately makes it very hard to enjoy the process of being an athlete. And then a third unique stressor that I'll highlight, and one of my favorite ones, is that everyone has an opinion on how you're doing. Because people love sports, they feel like they can watch it and they can be an expert. They'll say, "Why didn't you do this?" or "Why didn't you do that?" Um, and that's different than other sports. There's so much media in your face, people that are interested in following you both in training and competition, and that isn't the same. And I joke with some people in finance that I work with, there's never a camera in their office watching them with their fingers on the keyboard, wondering, "Ooh, are they going to hit the wrong key here or make an error in their spreadsheet?" But that's a little bit what it's like to be an athlete. People are looking for you to make mistakes. They're commenting on you. They're measuring your outcomes. You're ranked on a list. So when the only measure of success is a number on a list, it becomes easier to lose sight of who you are outside of that number. You become so tied to introducing yourself with maybe your highest world ranking or your personal best. And that creates risk for you as an athlete by limiting your identity. Slide, please. So, how do athletes respond to these unique stressors? This is what we're going to talk about today. I think if you are on this call as an athlete, on this webinar as an athlete, you have maybe experienced some of these unique stressors. You can think about times that you've dealt with them really well, or potentially times where the stress of the moment or the focus on outcomes really impacted your performance. We're going to go through a couple of examples of what it looks like to be a resilient high performer versus an at-risk high performer. Just to be clear, both types of high performers have really great ambitions at heart. I remind people all the time that athletes are just trying to compete at their highest level and be the best that they can be. Some of them have very healthy techniques that are built around resilience to help them do that. And other athletes haven't had the opportunity to potentially have mentors or coaches or parents or support staff teach them the importance of some of these protective mechanisms so that they don't become an at-risk high performer. Slide, please. So, what is resilience? People talk about building resilience or becoming resilient. Resilience reflects the positive adaptation to a significant stressor, continued self-regulated goal striving despite adversity. The one aspect about resilience that is so important to remember is that you actually have to face real challenges to build resilience. So there is one pathway where some athletes have too much continued success at too young of an age, and they continue to just ride this performance train that goes up and up. And they actually fail to create experiences that help them build resilience. Without those experiences of building resilience, they become more at risk at later stages in their career where things are likely to plateau or they're going to be hard to continue to improve. Resilience takes time. The wonderful thing about resilience is with each continued challenge, you start to respond better, quicker. You understand it. You have more faith in your ability to overcome that challenge, whether it's a loss that you shouldn't have experienced, or an injury in the sport, or deselection. There are endless numbers of challenges that you'll face in your athletic career. And as you start to face them with resilience, you understand that it takes time and that there is no shortcut. Resilience is earned through the repeated action of getting up again after a setback, and it compounds over time. Slide, please. Now we'll go into the at-risk high performer. Unlike the resilient high performer, that at-risk high performer feels more of a sense of time urgency. They often have this all or nothing thinking. So they're thinking, I have to do this, otherwise anything that I've done in my sport doesn't matter at all. They lose sight of the process of being an athlete, of potentially the idea that you take two steps forwards, one step backwards, that you have to overcome adversity, and they become overly focused on the outcome, either the final ranking, the time, or the performance metrics associated with their sport. In the context of doping, this increases the likelihood of making a bad decision because that time urgency piece makes them feel like they have to do something now or else it won't mean anything. They often take a shortcut. Slide, please. So why do athletes dope or engage in risky behavior? Sometimes it's an athlete who's following orders. I highlight this because oftentimes, even that high risk, uh, a high performer, they're trying to do something great. They're trying to achieve a ranking. They're trying to make a coach happy or a parent happy, or a support staff member happy. They're oftentimes doing it because they're unbelievably coachable and they're willing to do whatever somebody tells them to do to get better. And in this instance, it's unwillingly and unknowingly that they could engage in doping behavior or any type of risky behavior that puts them in an unethical area of sport. Sometimes it is an athlete who has not read the resources or checked the prohibited list. So willingly, so maybe they're taking a substance, but unknowingly, they don't understand the context of what they're taking. They haven't done necessarily all of their homework, and they're just living with a little bit of lack of education or knowledge or resources around that prohibited list. And then lastly, sometimes it is an athlete who feels there's no other option left, willingly and knowingly. So this is an example of an athlete who may feel that sense of time urgency. They have to compete and they have prize money on the table, or they have to prove something to their federation or to their coach to be able to keep their rostered spot. So there are more situations than this, but these are three situations that exist along a spectrum where all of them are doing this because they want to be the best version of themselves as an athlete, but the outcome is very risky. Slide, please. So in that idea that you can dope knowingly or unknowingly, there are different types of athlete personalities that tend to be more at risk. I've worked with athletes across a variety of sports. I've gotten to know all types of athletes. And some of the most wonderful and talented athletes have extreme vulnerabilities because of their dedication to sport. This is an example of the compliant athlete. So I oftentimes point out that it can be really hard because as a young athlete, you're constantly encouraged to be coachable, to do exactly what your coach says. You're rewarded for being right or perfect or achieving an outcome that somebody has pushed you to achieve. And that can create an environment of over-compliance, over-reliance on coaches, doctors, or agents. And when that gets to the age where they're a little bit older and potentially there's more on the line in the sport, that can increase the chances of an anti-doping violation. And again, that compliant athlete is striving to be perfect and striving to make sure that other people are happy with their performance and doing as they're told. It is coming from a place of wanting to have elite performance. There's also the profile of the cornered athlete, where they feel that doping is the only option. So this is an example of potentially an athlete who hasn't developed the skills around resilience. They haven't developed skills around having a holistic identity. They view themselves very narrowly as an athlete and only as an athlete. They potentially have struggled making decisions under pressure. So oftentimes there are very high pressure moments where you have to think very quickly in sport. And when you struggle to make the right decision, that can put you at risk of that doping behavior. And then believing that the risks are worth it because the cost of not winning feels even higher. And so the cornered athlete often has built their athletic identity on a very rocky foundation. They don't have a strong sense of self, of who they are, or strong values that exist outside of the outcomes related on sport. And this can happen because maybe they've had a coach or a parent or a support staff that has overemphasized winning, that has overemphasized the aspect that they are incredible because of everything that they've achieved in sport, and has failed to develop the part of the human outside of being that Olympic pressure, that Olympic mentality. Slide, please. So you can see here in these two psychological profiles, an athlete can arrive at the same risky outcome through very different pathways. How athletes define success influences their vulnerability to doping. Athletes who define success as beating others are more likely to hold favorable attitudes toward doping, while athletes who define success as improving themselves are more protected. And among that idea of improving themselves or being process focused or being a better version of yourself, that is the type of athlete that has built their high performance in resilience. They are the benchmark for their own performance and they are trying to move their own performance forward versus the high risk athlete who has built their performance based on comparisons and outcomes and numbers and metrics. Slide, please. Okay, now we're going to go into some of the decision-making tendencies that athletes may, or the decision-making scenarios that athletes may face in their journey that could put them at risk or help protect them from doping. There are always a lot of decisions to make at different moments in a career, and a lot of these decisions are made under pressure. Slide, please. So what does it look like to make a wrong decision under pressure versus deliberately working through it? So oftentimes these moments of pressure come, and the way that your brain works under pressure, the brain oftentimes gets overtaken by emotion. It can get narrowed on a very right versus wrong thinking, and it struggles to slow down and actually think about the options and the different outcomes. That's one of the hardest things about decision making under pressure. It can feel like there's a shortcut to making the right decision, or the best decision. And the right way is usually harder. So the right decision under pressure oftentimes requires you to step back and to slow down. Um, Whereas that deliberate resilience means purposely overcoming and working through it. So again, you have to slow down when that decision comes, think about different outcomes. That resilient athlete can tie their decision making back to their values and what the sport means to them, which is oftentimes rooted in that idea of overcoming challenges and showing up as a better version of themselves. Slide, please. So, how do you bring resilience into your decision making, especially under pressure? Um, Again, that high risk performer feels that sense of time urgency. Um, And that more resilient performer has the skills to slow down and make that right decision. Slide, please. So how do you slow down in the moment? So here are a couple of tools for you to think about what you can do in that moment of being faced with that high pressure decision making that could potentially lead to an undesirable outcome in your career. And these are just a few examples of some questions you can ask. Pause and ask, how much trust have I placed in this person or system without stopping to think about it? Again, oftentimes athletes are very coachable, they're very compliant, and they put a lot of trust in that system around them. Some of the red flags is to think about the coach-athlete relationship, the doctor-athlete relationship, the agent-athlete relationship, or other relationships with support staff that may have an influence over the compliance of that athlete. You can check your assumptions. Oftentimes people are too optimistic, too trusting, or too believing because they want so badly to have the outcome that they know they're capable of, which can allow them to want to create a shortcut and place too much faith in a system without slowing down and asking the right questions. Ask before you act. So ask questions not to be combative or disagreeable, but to be armed with information. Again, there's a difference in being coachable and also putting yourself in the driver's seat and asking questions versus coming across as, some athletes can be afraid to ask too many questions because they don't want to come across as not trusting or being uncooperative. But it's very important to know that you are at the center of your own sporting journey and that you're allowed to ask questions and be armed with that information. Slide, please. So how can you get into the driver's seat? You can be agreeable and still ask questions. It is okay to be curious and inquisitive. You can trust someone and still verify what they are telling you. You can still believe in your coach, believe in your support staff, and still check resources on your own. Still ask follow-up questions. Confidence in who you are makes it easier to do this. So I think at different stages of your career, you can have different levels of confidence. If you think about confidence as a skill, it's often peaks as a skill when you've had a series of good events. So you've had a series of good outcomes, a series of good marks in your sport, a series of good metrics. Your confidence typically skyrockets. Typically, that it's really hard in sport to continue to go up and up and up and continue to improve. So at some point, you're going to plateau or your performance is going to dip. So oftentimes, when your confidence is very high after a series of wins, you experience some form of adversity. During that adversity is when it's really great to rely on skills that are built around resilience. So challenging yourself to overcome the challenge, challenging yourself to have continued goal attainment, challenging yourself to continue to maintain your confidence even in the face of adversity. But oftentimes, your confidence will dip after a plateau or a poor performance because you don't have that outcome that's associated with your sense of worth because your identity is too tied to your sport. When that happens, it's easier to sit in the passenger seat because you don't have enough confidence in what you're doing in your journey, and you're looking for something that's going to help bring your confidence up. So it's also really important to think about where is your confidence as an athlete and how can you build a real stable set of skills to maintain confidence even when performances don't go as well as you want to. I oftentimes draw the analogy of building a confidence made out of a brick house where a bad performance, that house doesn't shake and it stays really sturdy, versus building confidence out of a house of toothpicks where every good performance you can pile on another toothpick and that house can get higher and higher. But as soon as there's one experience of adversity, that house blows down. So when you're building confidence, really think about building that brick house of confidence to stay in that driver's seat of your career. Slide, please. Using identity as fuel for resilience. Nikki did a fantastic job of touching on this at the beginning of the talk. Athletes who receive this value-based and identity-focused anti-doping education, not just information about rules, show significantly higher trust in anti-doping systems and stronger intentions to support clean sport. So how can you build some values-based and identity-focused anti-doping education? Well, there are a few ways. The best place to start is asking yourself some questions around who you are outside of your sport or what values you really look to bring into your sport. Oftentimes, athletes get into sport because they really value hard work and hard effort. They get a sense of joy out of continuing to persist under conditions of adversity. They like the relationships that they've been able to form in sport and makes them feel alive. When they start to think about these values allow them to direct themselves to decisions that align with their values instead of decisions that contradict their values. And then again, on that identity piece, slide please. You were always more than an athlete. So for athletes that are on this webinar, I would encourage you to think, oftentimes when people ask you who you are or what you're doing, you may respond with an upcoming competition, where you're at in your training cycle, how your performance is improving, or maybe some of the athletic challenges you're currently facing. I remember when I was an athlete, people would ask me how I am. I would be like, oh, I'm in my off season. I'm enjoying life. I'm not running as much as I used to, right? The answers are often tied to who you are as an athlete. And it's really important to step back and think, who am I outside of being an athlete? So potentially that athletic identity can be a huge part of who you are as a person. But most people are also students. They have hobbies. They have friends external to the sports. They have family members. They can be a sister, a brother, a daughter, a parent. Maybe they love to travel or cook. Um, these are some of the aspects around my identity, dog lover. So these are some things that you can think about outside of being an athlete. Who are you and how can you pour energy to fill up those portions of your identity so that when a sporting event goes poorly or you experience an injury or a moment of adversity, you can go to one of these other areas and pull the energy from that area. Think about, your role as a sister or a friend or somebody who has another hobby and realize that there's much more to your life and to who you are than just the sport that you're competing in. The importance of having that balanced identity makes it easier to recognize that the risks are not worth the reward. So you spend so much time in your competitive environment that it becomes your whole world. I often joke that when I tell people outside of my sport what my personal best is, they don't know the difference between a 9 minute and 35-second steeplechase and a 10 minute and 35-second steeplechase. To them, both of those sound very fast. But in the world of sport that we live in, milliseconds and seconds are so meaningful. But that is just because of that really small environment that we're in. And if we can zoom out and actually put these seconds or minutes or metrics in a more realistic perspective, we can feel less threatened by our identity by these metrics. So it's very important to remember the unique environment you live in as an athlete and how much pressure you put on yourself around those metrics and thinking people outside of it, they don't know. They think you're an amazing athlete. They want you to be happy. They think that every performance that you do is often very impressive, and it can be you that is judging yourself too much on this narrow identity. Building that true resilience is having enough of a foundation outside of sport, and that result, season, or one decision does not define you. I oftentimes encourage a lot of the athletes that I work with, if they think that they don't have time to pursue a part-time education or full-time education, if they don't have time to do another hobby or build another sense of identity outside the sport, I really challenge that athlete to think about their line of thinking and what's leading them to think that they don't have enough time. Oftentimes, when I work with athletes, I encourage them to pour energy into something in addition to their sport, and that ends up actually helping their overall performance because they can go into competitive environments and take more risk because they know that when they leave their competitive arena, there's another aspect of who they are that is very important to them. So they have a more balanced approach. Oftentimes, when people don't build identity, they really struggle when the sport's taken away from them. So it's important to know that who you are if the sport is taken away and what other parts of identity can you lean on. So these are questions to be asking yourself to make sure that you have invested in knowing who you are outside of your bubble of being an athlete. Slide, please. So, what are some next steps? We've talked about the importance of building resilience, of building identity. And now we'll go into some steps for you as athletes or of coaches or of support staff members to think about next in helping build resilience and identity. Slide, please. So one thing that I would like to reiterate is the importance around seeking help. So oftentimes we have a misconception that asking for help means that you are not mentally tough. I like to think about help-seeking behavior as a part of mental toughness. So very mentally tough athletes actually have the power and the ability to ask for help when they need it. They have built the self-awareness that they can't do everything on their own and that they need support staff to help move them forward. Um, Seeking help, this misconception that it's not related to being mentally tough, um, is a misconception. This there can be a belief that asking for help is a sign of weakness, but in reality, the best athletes recognize that they don't have all the answers. They seek advice, they ask questions, and they use expertise around them to make informed decisions. You have to be able to manage the uncertainty that is inherent in elite sport. There is no certain outcome in sport, which is what makes it so wonderful. I always remind athletes if we knew who was going to win before the competition, we wouldn't have the competition. If we knew what somebody's career was going to end up like, it wouldn't be as exciting to follow them. Part of the joy of sports is the uncertainty and managing the uncertainty. That's what makes it so exciting. No athlete is expected to know everything. And this also relates to what risky behavior might look like or to what doping might look like. If you're unsure about a substance or a supplement or a situation, don't guess. Use that uncertainty as a signal to seek out that more reliable information. So accept that uncertainty is an inherent part of that sport and know when to seek help and to ask for more information. Then there are resources. Trusted resources and professionals are there to help you make informed decisions. You have the right to ask questions, seek a second opinion, and say no if something doesn't feel right. Slide, please. So the two biggest takeaways from today is a strong sense of who you are outside of the sport is one of the most powerful things you can build. It protects you when the pressure is highest and the shortcuts seem the most tempting. If you know who you are and you're strong in your values and your identity, it's much easier to have that resilient response to these higher pressure moments that can feel like they are threatening your career. It's much easier for you to ground yourself in your values and ground yourself in who you are outside of the sport and make the right decision for you as a person for the long term versus the wrong decision that maybe allows you to achieve what you think you need to achieve in the short term as an athlete. Slide, please. Um, I mentioned at the beginning that I was a 3,000-meter steeplechaser. The thing that is wonderful about the 3,000-meter steeplechase is that it is 7.5 laps. You have to clear barriers, and to me, it is a great metaphor for life. There are some races where you clear all the hurdles seamlessly. It feels effortless and amazing. There are some hurdles that knock you down on your face, and you have to figure out how you're going to get back up again, and it can feel like the earth is crumbling around you. This is what sport can feel like. There are some barriers that you clear, there are some that you knock down, and there are some that knock you down. But it's all about how you choose to respond to that adversity. Do you choose to respond in a way that is going to make you proud long term, that is tied to the values that are inherent in why you started the sport in the first place? Or are you going to respond in a way that is going to be a shortcut and not allow you to achieve what you are capable of if you really invested in a long-term solution? Slide, please. That is it for the content of my presentation today. So I'm excited to open it up for some questions from the audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lenny. I love the steeplechase metaphor. I think that's very appropriate. So before we do go to our live Q&A, perhaps while our audience are taking a moment to, I guess, digest the information that you've given and think about what questions they might like to ask, audience, please pop them in the Q&A so it's easy for us to find them. But before we jump over to those, I did just want to quickly introduce this resources slide. We've pulled this together for you. As always, you'll get the slides after the session today. And on here, there are a few links to IOC Athlete 365 resources. You'll find Dr. Lenny Waite's website and contact details on there, and the link to the ITA Athlete Hub. So, to jump to our first question from Juan, and the question is, and my colleagues have translated this from Spanish into English for me so I can appropriately read it to you, Lenny. In your experience, what creates the greatest pressure to dope? And the examples that this person has provided is health-related issues, the risk of sanctions, financial losses, or loss of influence. So, is there a greatest pressure that you see, or does it depend?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my experience, and again, this is as a psychologist and thinking about the person, it often ties to the environment that that person is in and how they're socialized. So I've seen that risk be the biggest depending on who the person is. So, for example, oftentimes people who are overemphasized as superstars and they're supposed to achieve a certain type of outcome. It's more related to that loss of influence. Like if they don't dope, then everybody who looks at them will view them as less effective, and they'll lose their status. So they feel like they have to. I've definitely seen cases where contract negotiations are upcoming and they know there's a metric that they have to hit to be able to re-sign their sponsor, or negotiate their contract. And that has a very clear deadline for them to hit that metric. So that's where that's really tied to salary and what they see is their viability of staying in the sport, and the risk of doping for that athlete outweighs the fear of potentially not being able to compete in the sport. Yeah, I would say it's tied to different aspects of a person and different stage of career that they're in.
Thank you. Another question has come through from Anna. And this is quite interesting. So Anna says, do you think talking about resiliency would better fit as a separate education session, or whether it should be incorporated into like a clean sport 101 session? So separately, together, any better
Yeah.
approach in your opinion?
Yeah, so I definitely talk about resilience as a skill for all athletes in all contexts. And so I would say it's almost the best approach would be stepwise, right? Kind of teaching the fundamentals of resilience because that is needed when experiencing your first underperformance or your first injury or a coaching change that maybe you didn't want to happen, or even conflict with a teammate. There are plenty of opportunities that athletes experience in sport for them to start understanding what a resilience response looks like, versus a response that potentially doesn't allow them to take advantage of the challenge that they faced. And then I think specifically tying it to doping, especially if they've had this kind of education on resilience as when they were younger, and that becomes part of their value set or something that they identify with as an athlete. And I think if in these really healthy sporting systems, athletes are taught about resiliency, they're told that they're resilient, and then that becomes part of their core identity as an athlete. And that feeds into doping education really nicely, especially when they're faced with maybe more pressures around doping, which, oftentimes when you're a young athlete, you're not exposed to that. You don't know much about it. You develop the skill of resilience. You become a older athlete who is competing more for money and status, and there are other outcomes associated with that. And doping starts becoming more of the picture. If you've already developed that skill around resilience, it provides a really great foundation to help navigate decision making around some of those high pressure moments in a career.
Thank you. And jumping to our next question from another Anna. When talking about self-identity outside of sport, what would be examples of those, or what values should an athlete rely on to protect their identity?
Yeah. So this is such a great question. And I oftentimes think about how, as a society, we do a really, really horrible job in actually living the values of creating a holistic identity. Like, I go to watch some youth sports games, and all the parents are saying, Johnny has the fastest throw I've ever seen. Susie's got the best running stride, and Jenny's gonna be the world's greatest basketball player. And their children and their parents and their coaches and their support staff are already building this sport related identity for these kids. They're injecting them with your worth matters because you are fast, or because you throw hard, or because you're really good at making baskets. And I oftentimes, talk to these parents, and I have to tell them, like, you really need to pause, because as you're injecting this sense of worth that's tied directly to these outcomes on the field. And it's really important instead to focus on the process of improvement. Like, you've really listened to your coach and you've gotten so much better, and think of where you are at the beginning of the season and where you are now, and allowing them to make decisions around what they want to get out of their sport, instead of just praising them for the outcomes that are tied to their events. And I say that because we always tell people to build a healthy identity, to invest in other aspects of themselves, but in an environment where we're only rewarding the athletic aspects of that person, there's no real example for them to do that. And so you have to create opportunities to allow them, one, to have experiences of what they enjoy and who they are outside of sport, and then to reinforce and give some form of reward for those identities so they continue to pour into it. Um, on the personal side, when I graduated from university, I told my parents I was going to run professionally. Their response to me was, "That's great. What else are you going to do?" Which is such a powerful thing to come from parents who I felt like really supported me in my athletic career. And in that moment, I thought they were going to tell me, like, "Oh, that's so awesome. Like, you go, you do that." Instead, they were like, "Okay, you have to continue to build out who you are as a person as well as who you are as an athlete." And so I continued to do my postgraduate degree while I trained internationally. And I would joke that the people in my statistics class for graduate school, they didn't know the difference in the mile time that I told them. They just thought it was so awesome that I was going out and traveling around the world and racing on the weekend. And having that perspective in my life as an elite athlete really helped me scale the wins and losses. It made me realize that what I was doing was so special and so unique. And because I had this other group of just academic students who were so just excited for me, I realized that, as an athlete, you become so enclosed in your environment and on the wins and losses. But if you can pull in other people and other people's perspectives and realize how special and unique it is to be able to compete at a high level, it just makes the journey so much better. So a long answer, but it takes a lot of effort, and it's not just the athlete's role to build that identity, but having some of the modeling around them on what that looks like.
Thank you, Lenny. That was going to be my question, if you hadn't already answered it, was around, I guess, advice for the people around the athlete to support that resilience or building the resilience. But yeah, thank you. You've answered my question without me asking it in that answer. We do have another question from Mohammed, and they say, "Do you think the current doping sanctions are sufficient? Or is focusing on prevention and building values the sustainable solution for clean sport?" So
Sorry,
maybe, so
sorry,
maybe
can you
two,
ask that one more time?
yeah, two separate parts. So, or maybe related parts. But do you think the current doping sanctions are sufficient?
Hmm.
Is the first part to it, and then is focusing on prevention and building valuable values the sustainable solution for clean sport? Um, so maybe we can, uh, how do you want to answer that?
Um, well, I can start with I'll start from my values-based
Yep.
philosophy. So as a psychologist, I'm trained a lot in thinking, punishment isn't the answer, right? It's creating reinforcements for them to choose the right behavior first and to reward what it looks like to do the right thing so that you don't have to go and punish everything. So like of course we're at a place in doping culture where I would say me as an athlete, if we didn't sanction doping, I would be outraged and it has to happen. But how can we continue to have some of those doping sanctions, but also really work on that prevention and building values and having just a more like really strong base on what it looks like to make right decisions throughout a career and more emphasis on that so that we can like and this is like an idealistic view, right? Move away from having to punish. Like I really like giving athletes things that they can do to make themselves better, ways to approach success, and getting away from thinking about like the punishment and the negative side of sport. And that's a very utopian answer though. So I think when we look at realistically, when we kind of zoom out of what my values are to the reality of the world, and I often use this analogy, is you look at the top of any profession, and typically there is some level of ethical gray areas or misalignment or people looking for shortcuts. And sport is just like any other profession where if the rewards are really high, people are going to take the risk. And that's, you see it in medical professions, you see it in finance professions, you see it in law professions, and you see it in athletes as well. Um, I think it's a two-pronged approach where you work on building values and prevention. And I think there's been a lot of research that has looked at even kind of the moral values and the ethics of the parents and how they socialize the kid in sport and how they're raised in sport have a big impact on long-term doping behavior. But we're not going to be able to control all of that from just education and building values, that there have to be sanctions involved in order to try to protect the integrity of the elite athletes that are really trying to do it right.
Thank you, Lenny. And maybe one final question from Mohammed. And they've talked about this idea of tracking athletes who use performance enhancing drugs and I guess some of the consequences that they face as a result of that choice or that behavior. And the idea of, I guess, using that as an example to serve a lesson to other people.
Tracking athletes who have tested positive or tracking athletes who have um, and then using that to try to prevent other people from
Yeah.
doping. Yeah, I mean, this is like, it's similar. I think I have a similar perspective of the previous question where I always wish we didn't have to go to these like intense measures to like create examples out of people in order to edge people to do the right behavior. My real philosophy around this is like kind of fear-based behaviors are not going to be as good as values-based behavior. So if you're doing something out of fear because you don't want it to happen to you, that's not as sustainable as or successful as doing something out of values or trying to achieve a certain type of reward or positive outcome for yourself. So oftentimes these like doing things from like the a negative perspective doesn't sit right with my values as a psychologist. But again, until we can get to a point where people can feel like there is a lot of integrity in their sport, I think we'll continue to see this type of like punishment or setting example of what we're doing with athletes. And then, on the flip side of that, I oftentimes think about like these cases, it involves more than the athlete, and the athlete can be potentially over punished. And like I said, even in my talk, there have been some amazing athletes who have just wanted the best from themselves that have had a moment of not having proper support or education or just not building the right values or resilience around the sport that allows them to make a bad decision. And do I think their entire life should be ruined for it? I don't know. It really depends on the situation. So you can go back and forth on the value of these aspects, and it's really going to take a deep longitudinal research to see what is the most effective way that leads to the best outcomes, and also realizing that it's never going to be perfect.
Thank you, Lenny. We just did get one question through in the chat, which is quite interesting. So if we could touch on it briefly. And the question was, how would you have any advice around, I guess, parents who are thinking that supplements, as an example,
Mhm.
um, are what their child needs to be successful in sport. Do you have any advice around that as I guess for the parents themselves, but perhaps for the other people in the support network of the athlete who can, talk to parents about that maybe?
Yeah, so I always, a registered dietitian is always a great person to bring in to your athletes journey in order to help understand if one supplementation is appropriate, what supplementation is appropriate. And definitely for like younger youth athletes, I oftentimes challenge parents to think about there are so many things that an athlete can do to get better at a young age related to like their mentality, the environment that they're in, how they show up at training, their focus, their thought processes that doesn't require like buying an additional substance that they think is going to lead to better performance. And the longer that we can keep an athlete away from thinking that there's a pill or a quick fix for helping them get better, the more skills they build for themselves and realizing that like they actually have a lot of control of moving themselves forward. So I have a perspective around that. Those are oftentimes like once an athlete has formed a lot of these base skills, really diving into the margins and thinking how they can get the 1 to 2% better and using supplements, resources, additional tools. But there's a lot that a kid can do before having to get to that point. And if they do get to that point, I'd always suggest bringing in a registered dietitian expert for that.
Thank you, Lenny. What a great message to end today on, as we are unfortunately out of time. So a big thank you to you, Lenny, sharing your story, sharing your expertise, and for our audience for joining us today as well, and asking some really great questions. Just a bit of a heads up of what's coming up next month. We have on the 26th of August, we will be doing a webinar on youth athletes competing at major events. So, athletes, if you are going to Dakar or if you are supporting an athlete going to the Dakar Youth Olympic Games, then this webinar is for you. The registration is open. You can scan the QR code. You will get the slides after the session. So that just leaves me to finally wrap up today. If you do have any questions, once you've had a moment to reflect and take in everything that we've talked about today, please do send us an email, education@ita.sport. I'm more than happy to try and find answers for you. So a big thank you again to you, Lenny, and of course a big thank you to our audience. I can see all the positive feedback coming through in the chat. So what a great what a great Thursday, I should say. We're Thursday wherever we are in the world, I think at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Lenny. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you online again next month.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to be able to chat to everybody. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.